Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Archival Encounters lecture series, a series of talks and conversations that brings together scholars, writers, artists, and cultural creators to discuss the limitations and imaginative possibilities of engaging with colonial archives. Today, I have the immense pleasure and honor to welcome Hazel Carby and Katherine McKittrick for a conversation about Carby's recent award-winning book, Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands. The session will begin with a reading by Professor Carby, which will be followed by a dialogue with Professor McKittrick. And I will just briefly introduce our two speakers. Hazel Carby is a Charles C. and Dorothea S. Dilley Professor Emeritus of African-American Studies and Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Yale University, and a Fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts. She's the author of Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, published in 2019, and selected as one of the books of the year for 2019 by the Times Literary Supplement. The book is the winner of the British Academy's Naif Al-Rutland Prize for Global Cultural Understanding 2020, finalist of the John Hope Franklin Publication Prize, SAA 2020, and shortlisted for the Penn Hessel Tiltman Prize 2020. Imperial Intimacies is a history of British Empire, told through one woman's search through generations of family stories. It moves between Jamaican plantations, the countryside of Devon, the port cities of Bristol, Cardiff, and Kingston, and the working class states of South London. It is an intimate personal history and a sweeping summation of the violent entanglement of two islands. It charts the British Empire's interweaving of capital and bodies, public language, and private feeling. Hazel Carby is also the author of Cultures in Babylon, Black Britain and African America, 1999, Race Man from 1998, and Reconstructing Womanhood, The Emergence of the Afro-American Woman Novelist, 1987. She's the co-author of The Empire Strikes Back, Race and Racism in 70s Britain, from 1982. In 2019, Hazel Carby was awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Letters from Wesleyan University and the Stuart Hall Outstanding Mentor Award from the Caribbean Philosophical Association. In 2016, she received the J.B. Hubbell Medal for Lifetime Achievement in American Literature, awarded by the Modern Language Association. Katherine McKittrick is Professor of Gender Studies and cross-appointed to the Departments of Geography and Cultural Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. She's the author of Demonic Rounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle from 2016, and edited and contributed to Sylvia Wynter on Being Human as Praxis from 2015. Her monograph, Dear Science and Other Stories, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. It is an exploration of Black methodologies. She's currently working on two projects. The first, unnamed, attends to how theories of ecology and extraction emerge in Black diaspora studies. The second, Pastel Blue, studies color, color theory, image making, and Black aesthetics. So thank you so much to both of you for this honor. We'll look forward to hearing you, and I hand it over to you. Thank you.
So, hello, thank you, Daniela, for inviting me to be part of this. I wanted to start with a reading. I know this is part of a wider project in thinking about archives, and I wanted to read a piece that asks anyone watching who imagines they might enter an archive to think about what it means to be there, to think very seriously, even if you're just using, colonial archives digitally, to think very seriously about their classification systems, and also to consider how what you find may affect you quite deeply. I dressed conservatively. I did not appear to be a disruptive or unruly researcher. I was indistinguishable from the others who arrived at the National Archives early in the morning and who stood patiently waiting for the doors to open, while swans, graceful in their every movement, nuzzled the weeds underwater. As they raised their long necks and droplets of water rolled on the surface of feather, I became aware of my own poor posture and straightened my spine. We who left late in the evening passed through doors that rapidly closed behind us and did not notice swans. We marched together to and from the Kew Gardens tube station every day, carrying computers and clutching umbrellas, too intent on our work to acknowledge each other with more than a brief incline of the head and a half smile. After leaving the locker room and climbing the stairs, all similarity with my fellow travellers ceased. They seemed to parse the same historical manuscripts day after day, while I sought to undermine the edifice of knowledge to which I was granted generous access. I was exposed, but felt completely in the dark. Fluorescent light was diffused across the room from large grey rectangles embedded in the ceiling. Behind me was a wall of glass through which, if I wanted to turn, I could have seen the sky, swans, geese, ducks swimming on a pond, and the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. The wings of jumbo jets landing at Heathrow Airport skimmed the roofs of the neighbourhood, but inside the room, the roar of their Rolls-Royce engines was muted. Like everyone else at work in the National Archives of the UK, I was hermetically sealed away from birdsong, from the smell of wet soil, from the fragrance of shrubs and flowers, from the drone of London traffic, from the sounds and rhythms of everyday life. The building precludes distraction. Natural and artificial light illuminate inconspicuous interiors. This room is designed to promise transparency in all transactions, a promise that nothing will be withheld or concealed, that everything can be known. In this vacuum of light, no shadows would dare fall to obscure, disguise, or blunt the edges of documented truths bound in files and books and papers tied together with ribbon. Uniform exposure to the light offers assurance that what is past can be recovered, made easily accessible and available to all who have the time to sit and stare. Revelation, however, does not ensure accountability. That morning in early summer, I sat at a computer workstation searching the catalogue Discovery. What eventually surfaced on the screen sent a jolt through my spine. The sudden movement caused the four wheels on my chair to roll across the surface of the industrial strength floor covering. A nondescript weave of rectangles in multiple shades of soft greys, the carpet duplicated the shapes on the ceiling. There was nothing in either pattern to catch the eye and distract attention from the serious business of research. A room full of people thinking is quiet, but it is not silent. There was a low-frequency hum of constant activity. Pages were turned, documents were scanned and delivered, but all motion was circumspect. Coughs, sneezes, and clearing of throats were stifled. My urge to exclaim was strangled in my throat, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I was relieved to see that the abrupt movement of my chair had not attracted attention or disrupted the gentle flow of hush that washed across the room. I had found what I sent out to discover, but I was staring at the carpet instead of the catalogue entries. I was reluctant to submit the call numbers that would trigger the delivery of materials to 14B, the number of my bright orange cubby and dull green desk. My search was for financial matters, for property. Methodically, I had found records created or inherited by Her Majesty's Treasury, and within them the records of commissions and committees which reflect core Treasury functions, such as financial and establishment matters. I felt compromised by the language of the system of classification, the language of dissimulation I was forced to follow. I refuse the terms and the conditions that shaped the world in which these records were created. I need a different language, a different map, different truths. I temporarily avoided the object of my search, what I had at some point to confront by thinking instead about the structure of the classification system that determined my path. The catalogue consisted of a hierarchy of terms which organized knowledge. The intention is to provide a gradual progression, a descent into the matters for which any researcher seeks. However, when I found the matter I was looking for, I was not sure that I wanted to see it. Persistence, being determined to find out, to know, to interrogate, kept me in my chair, but I was also cautious, hesitant, weighing and calculating the costs of finding out. I considered the source of my hesitation, my fractured sense of being, my loss of a singular I who knew what she wanted. I probed my conflicting motivations as a researcher, as a daughter, as a Black woman descended from those I was about to find. I weighed opposing outcomes and fought the indecision and immobility, rooted in the tension between intentions and desires. I wanted to seize my ambivalence as an opportunity, a moment of historical consciousness, an important recognition of the fictional nature of a unified self. There is no simple I marking my subjectivity here. Having fallen down the equivalent of Charles L. Dodgson's rabbit hole, I needed to take stock, to reassemble my multiple selves and motives, to pull myself together and catch my breath. The organization of knowledge in the classification system appeared on its surface perfectly logical, in accord with established pathways to enlightenment. But I landed not in the light of knowledge, but beneath its surface, in the soil where it began to take shape, in the blackness where the roots of enlightenment become entangled with the rhizomes of unreason. The architecture and pathways of the chamber of knowing in which I found myself are the product of a history I have spent a career contesting and challenging. In commissions and committees, I tunneled through various bodies dealing with compensation and other issues relating to slavery, land, and war, until I encountered the records of the Office of Registry of Colonial Slaves and Slave Compensation Commission, which took the form of a Cheshire cat curled up in the darkest corner of its burrow in wait for me. Its grin widened, its maw opened, and its body dissolved, leaving the words Slave Compensation Commission behind, hovering in the atmosphere of fetid breath. I was unsure of my footing, balanced precariously on the terrain of treachery as well as dissimulation. In an alternative world, a world that was just and equitable, the title slave compensation would mean that the brief of this commission was to compensate the enslaved for the theft of their selves, of their labor, of their offspring, and of their future. Compensation for the wealth wrung from their agony, wealth generated from lives of unremitting toil, wealth welling up from an inundation of tears, of pain, of frustration, and of fury, flooding the hold of slave ships, watering the unforgiving soil of plantations, nurturing the seeds of rebellion. Immense wealth produced by the labor of generations of enslaved human beings enriched and was consumed within the colonial heart of empire. Generations of laborers were rewarded with immiseration and ineffable physical and psychological violence. The language of the archives is specious. Duplicity burdens research with a terrible weight. I forced myself to pause, I closed my eyes, then indulged in the comfort of fantasy. It seemed important to dwell just for a moment on the possibility that compensation might actually have been granted to the enslaved, instead of enriching those who on paper, and in the eyes of Her Majesty's Treasury, were designated owners of their bodies. I held my breath. There should be space for alternative realities, alternative ways of knowing in the archive. There should be room for imagining a world in which justice, not injustice, triumphed, a world where wealth had been returned to those who had produced it. But I knew that I was wasting time, that no one should look to the colonial archives for social justice. In order to complete the task at hand, I forced breath back into my lungs, opened my eyes, lifted my chin, clenched my jaw, and continued to search. Committees and commissions are not the only bodies buried here in boxes and files and tied with ribbon and string. Truths by any measure or definition are difficult, if not impossible, to excavate, to expose to the light. Over the course of 10 years, I followed the White Rabbit, confronting and interrogating colonial archives in London and in Kingston, Jamaica, in search of records. In 1816, the British government instituted a process to register all of the enslaved in every territory of its empire. Human beings who lived and breathed were confined within the straitjackets of columns and bound within ledgers, registration, slave registers. By 1815, the first year of registration was complete, and henceforth until emancipation, records of increase and decrease were updated every 3 years. Increase covered birth and purchase. Decrease covered sale, escape, being sent to the workhouse, and death. But it did not distinguish between death from torture, punishment, disease, or a broken heart. The language of these documents confirms that the only interest in keeping these registers of bodies was as accounts of profit and or loss. What life raft of reason is within reach of the descendants of those listed in these account books of enslavement, of empire? Is there hope, comfort, or escape to be found in remembering only those who survived? I grieved for lives maimed, destroyed, cut short. If someone I found disappeared without explanation from a subsequent record, I hoped they ran fast and far, and renamed themselves so as to be forever hidden from capture by former owners and the archives. Records of those condemned, viciously punished and murdered stilled me. As each person in the register was recorded, they were categorized not as a human being, but as property by HMS Treasury. This practice of dehumanization is preserved and reproduced without end in the language and the structure of classification, the headings, the subheadings, and definitions. No one should imagine that entering this archive is journeying back in time to a history that is past, that is over. Traveling through the archive imposes an experience of time that is not linear, but circuitous, a passage through the living language of humans as property is an ever-present entrapment in and assertion of the right to own. It is a continual imposition of subjection and endless possession. To enter this archive is to become conscripted into an ongoing process of trading in flesh. In Portland, Jamaica in 1817, John Carby, Negro, 6 years old, Creole, is listed as son of Nancy, 30 years old, African. I followed broken threads of information written into ledgers by the hands of clerks who cared about tallying numbers, detailing property, and establishing ownership, but had no care for the accuracy of the names of this property, for they did not regard it as human. I found precious but inconsistent traces of more than one Rose Monroe. In Hanover, an enslaved Rose Monroe, African, said to be 26 years old in 1817, was registered as 38 in 1829. In Kingston, in 1820, a Rose Monroe, free black, 8 months old, was baptized. A daughter, I wondered? In 1822, the manumission of a Rose Monroe for 10 shillings is recorded. I have utilized the tension between my working self as a scholar, from being a descendant, a daughter, a granddaughter, and a great-granddaughter. I created connections between disparate threads of ancestry, followed the name Rose as it passed through generations until it was bestowed as if a gift upon my grandmother, Millicent Rose Monroe, who, known simply as Rose, gave birth to my father in Kingston, Jamaica in 1921. I knew that I would be able to assemble only fragments of histories and traces of ancestors, that I could not recreate the lives of all of those from plantations, even though I found this conclusion unacceptable. As a daughter and granddaughter, I was left bereft, dissatisfied and unsettled that lives silenced in and by the archives and by enslavement are irretrievable. In the large document room, I walked to and fro the reserve desk, carrying large grey boxes. They were bulky and heavy. Inside each box was a single volume of triennial returns for the parishes of Portland and St. George's, Jamaica, beginning in 1817 and continuing through 1820, 1823, 1829, and 1832. I clutched each box tightly to my chest, using my body as a brace, afraid that one would slip from my arms, fall and burst apart, spilling its contents over the floor. As I reached a table, I lowered each box gently and removed a white cotton ribbon. The passage of time was marked not by the measure of seconds, minutes, and hours, but by the repetitious nature of my movements, which assumed the character of ritual. I stood with bent back, lifted a lid, set it aside, and stared down at the contents of a box, while the first of many clouds of particles I disturbed rose and settled. Squeezing my fingers between the interior edges of each box and a register, I gripped each tome and lifted. When these ledgers were created, copied, bound, transported across the Atlantic, and stored, did officials of the British Treasury imagine that, like their empire, these records would last forever? Tropical environments, humidity, insects, ocean journeys, human neglect defeated the aims of clerks to preserve records in the form they intended. Bookboards with marbled covers separated from their spine and signatures. Bindings have partially disintegrated. Rag paper pages have been attacked by mold, but most of the stitching is held. As I searched through the registers and turned page after page, it was as if the particles of hemp, linen, cotton, and board that constituted these ledgers of the long dead had a consciousness, were seeking to attach themselves to me, refused to be neglected or left behind. Reddish orange, brown and cream fragments drifted around me, covered my clothes, and worked their way inside, stuck to my skin, settled in my hair. I was unable to leave the dead who cleaved to me. As I walked from the archive to the tube station, I left a trail of fragments in my wake. On the train, I stood in a pool of residue. In the shower, I watched as particles flushed down the drain. When I awoke, they were on my pillow. I left remains in the house of my closest friends. As I passed through customs and border protection on the other side of the Atlantic, I hesitated, wondering if I should declare that I carried this residue on my person and in my heart.
Thank you, Hazel. That was so beautiful. And like Imperial Intimacies, it has me unsettled and joyous, actually. So I appreciate your work so much. I want to maybe begin my questions or the conversation with the piece that you just read, because one of the things that stands out to me are the tensions between the actual infrastructure of the archive. So we have the windows and the lighting and waiting outside to go in, the carpet, the chair, the ribbons. There's so the actual building itself and what's inside the building is interrupted by you, yet at the same time it demands a particular kind of conformity. So you straighten your back before going in, and there's a moment, where you're carrying the boxes and they're extremely heavy, and so there's also this embodied, there's a demand for a kind of embodied presence that sort of demands something of your comportment, but that you can't quite comport yourself to. And I think the end of your narrative kind of speaks to that, and how the archive, what is something other than the infrastructure itself. It attaches itself to you, and you take it with you. So maybe you can talk a little bit about those tensions between the infrastructure and embodiment. And
yeah, I mean, I think it's something I wanted people to think about very seriously. The archives, in very complex ways and ways that thought about their geography, the question of space. I mean, coming from your work, right, taking it right out of your work, the specificity of thinking about place and time, about particularity, and what it means to be not just a Black researcher, but someone who wants to create a counter-narrative, a counter-historical narrative. Most historians just take for granted that they have the right to just, to go into archives and then translate whatever they quote unquote find there into their histories. It's a privilege, really. They don't have to consider the question of space, they don't have to consider how they are organized, because they are producing narratives that completely conform to, do not question the conventions of history, the way that do not question the way we've organized knowledge. So to question that very deeply, it seemed to me, was not just about finding different information in an archive, but was actually submitting the archive the archive itself and the process of discovering knowledge and its organization to a sort of forensic analysis, if you like. And as I say, I began to think that this was, it was a very complex process that meant that I couldn't just pretend that I was a researcher like anyone else, because I didn't want to fall into that convention of what happens, you know, when predominantly white historians may go and look exactly the same material, but never have to consider the process of finding it. And at the same time, I couldn't neglect the fact that I was a researcher. I couldn't neglect the fact that, you know, I'd been trained as a scholar, that I've been a scholar for so much of my life. So I wanted to talk very openly about what the fragmentation of all those different roles that we have as Black scholars, as Black feminist scholars, what it actually does to us, that there isn't, and that's when I came to this conclusion that, you know, the discovery catalogue, the process of organizing, you know, conventional knowledge, the process of conventionally dividing knowledge into disciplines, these are all inventions. And also the sense that there is just a singular I scholar working within these conventions is also a fiction. So it was really the sort of multiple layers of trying to uncover. I mean, we talk very easily about how race is a fiction, but this is the underside of the Enlightenment. It's unreasoning, but a lot more follows from that in terms of the various roles we've adopted in uncovering this knowledge. And I wanted to sort of embrace not just the fragmentation, but also the contradiction. You know, that sort of sense, you know, of a researcher of just wanting to go further and further and further, but also to think seriously what it meant to be a descendant and how I was not actually ready to find this knowledge and what it really meant.
Yeah, it's such a difficult process. I'm thinking about, you know, entering into those spaces, those institutional spaces where, you know, the Black feminist, you know, you're not supposed to inhabit that space. And when you do inhabit that space, as you said, you kind of live a contradiction. Like you just kind of like I'm thinking specifically about the physiological response, right? And how uncomfortable that can be. Like how your book and how the narrative that you just read actually, for me, illuminates the discomfort of the physical discomfort of entering into that space. So for me, it's the brutality of the archive is not just, it's an intellectual brutality. It's a historical brutality and a historical violence that is played out on the researcher, right? And on how they can walk through the world, right? And so for me, one of the things I quite like about your work, like all of your work, but most recently Imperial Intimacies, is how you use the device of storytelling to allow us to think about a way out of that contradiction. It's not necessarily resolved. You don't give us a solution, but you do interrupt the brutality with a mode of storytelling that provides a little bit of relief, and provides it shows that the archive is porous, or that the walls of the institution are porous.
Yeah, I think if we are about the work of producing counter narratives, we've thought a lot about the question of counter, but I think we've spent perhaps less time thinking about the question of narrative form. And so the challenge for me was being able to imagine how you could use storytelling, create a narrative which did not paper over any of the cracks of either working in the archives or trying to combine, as I do, the questions of history and memory. As I question how people have taken what history is and its conventions for granted, I also want to question memory. I mean, it seems to me that memory isn't, just turning to memory isn't a solution either, because it can be just as riddled with contradiction, with lies, with hiding as much as it exposes. And so the challenge is, could I actually build that into, you know, the story itself? And in some ways, you know, writers have been doing this for generations. Jane Austen is very adept, actually, at apparently allowing history into her narratives, but then shying away from it at some very key moments. So if you actually think about the way in which, you know, many novelists have actually tackled history, you can see that they are using storytelling devices that we can actually disassemble, and we can then use those moments of contradiction to actually pause any sense of, you know, a smooth, unbroken narrative, and deliberately break it, deliberately ask the reader to stop and think, and to actually be very aware of all the sort of mechanisms that's going into the storytelling, and to think about that, you know, very, very seriously. So offering resolutions would have been the opposite of where I think we are at the moment, actually. I think we're really trying at the moment to be far more disruptive. That's why in the opening of that piece, I was sort of, I was feeling that I was a very disruptive and unruly researcher.
Yeah.
But I was sort of, you know, I found myself looking, you know, like every other scholar, with my briefcase and my computer, and yes, as you said, you know, sort of straightening my back. But I wanted to have that there in the opening for the reader to realize that there's a real tension, you know, at work here. And there are actually a number of novelists who have been very influential. I mean, Michael Ondaatje is someone who captures this sort of tension. Amitav Ghosh in his sort of complete rewriting of, you know, the sort of British Empire and its trade in Indian bodies. I'm sort of thinking of that, you know, his great trilogy. He takes history very seriously, but he then, you know, interrupts it and subverts it. So if you're subverting history, then it seems to me the narrative itself has to be subverted. Does that make sense?
It does, and I'm thinking about as well, like the role of policing and policing the archive. And I remember when I went to the Library of Congress to do research on slave auction blocks for demonic grounds, and coming across a box, and this was post 9/11, so the security at the Library of Congress was multiplied like tenfold or something. There were Black security guards everywhere, policing sort of what you do. But I came across this box and it had the Green Hill auction block in it, which is the one I talk about in Demonic Grounds. But it was just like kind of just like thrown aside, and it just had a bunch of junk in it. I shouldn't say junk, but a bunch of papers that were not organized, they were not precise. And so I went to grab it, and a security guard, came and took the box from me and, provided the white gloves, right? And so there is something about that experience that I had where it was this kind of confusion that needs to be straightened out the moment that you're interested in what kind of knowledge is being produced within that. And so that also, pairing that with the genre of storytelling as well, like this, for me, that's one way to not necessarily abandon the archives. I feel like, we go, right? We go and we do the research, and the task of telling the story of how the archive polices particular people in particular ways, and how it's a performance where you're under surveillance, which is always racialized and gendered, that the story or the storytelling or the genre, or as you said, like the subversion of history, I guess what I'm saying is right there in the archives for us, depending on the researcher, right? Depending on your eyes, I guess. And the kind of intellectual work you do, right? Which is always a kind of radical interdisciplinarity, which is to go into the archives and know that it's going to be a rebellious process, even if you comport yourself to enter the archives in a particular kind of way.
Which is also why I wanted to have a sense in the book that we need to create alternative archives too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I spent, in that piece I just read, I spent a lot of time actually sort of like detailing the sense of place and space.
Yes.
And I do that throughout the book. Every time I sort of move to a different space, I spend this is something else I've learned from you. I spend a lot of time thinking about the consequences of its geography, mm-hmm. of, its historical construction. It doesn't matter whether it's a kitchen, or a train station, or, the city of Bath. I want to very carefully sort of probe the consequences of thinking in these spaces and then translating them into writing. And every single space in the book, I sort of, I visited. I wanted to think. So when I went to visit where the plantation was in Portland, Jamaica, up near the Swift River, the stories that, my father had told me that led me there, I had to really pause and think about what it meant to be in that space, what it meant to walk in that space, and to have the account of my walking in the space in relation to how I, knew, but also had to sort of reimagine how the enslaved had climbed those hills, mm-hmm, shackled, mm-hmm. and how that sort of, they didn't just dwell in that ecology, but they also, shaped it. Yeah. They brushed past the ferns. They walked on those paths. Actually, many of them, perhaps they created, trying to, go to secret meeting places or whatever. So they were not just the ecology of these places included the conspiratorial. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. These spaces of resistance and secrecy, mm-hmm. Even while they were heavily policed. So there were all these laws, and they were always the Jamaica Assembly was always instituting new series of laws to try and surveil and police the movements of the enslaved, their everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to keep thinking, if they keep reintroducing all these laws and new ways of finding how to surveil people, it means that people were breaking them all the time. They actually weren't working. But the laws themselves, just like the slave registers, impose an appearance of order on what was actually total disorder.
Yeah.
They appear to impose reason on unreason. And so can we capture that contradiction in our storytelling?
Yeah, and how does geography and how does the ecology, including urban ecology, provide the conditions for people to reinvent what freedom means, right? So it's really kind of a there's a suturing, I think, between ecology and slavery that needs to be thought about more, whether it be kind of Winter's plot and plantation type of thing, gardening, and so on and so forth, but also what you say, like around this expert knowledge of the enslaved, of ecology, and how they use that. I mean, this to me is like, this is real geography. This is the, that sort of, that production of space that is taking place underneath and over top of the grids, the colonial grids that produce, that produce Blackness as object and so on and so forth. So there's something very meaningful about that, and that walk that you take, and the way that the roads are explained are a counter to what plantation slavery is, how it's supposed to be imagined.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a little, we are incredibly heavily surveyed, but on the other hand, I didn't want that to be a closure. I didn't want that just to be the resolution. I wanted to ask the question, well, why does this surveillance have to be continually reimposed and reinvented? And it is because there is this incredible, turbulence. Although, this was not the history I inherited. Growing up in Britain, our Caribbean parents didn't tell us any of this. There was actually a lot of shame covering the sense of the slave past. My parents weren't the generation that wanted to recover that. So there were bits of stories like the Swift River story, but there was also a lot of language use that covered up what actual relations, were.
Do you think that strategy of telling, not telling is that what you inherited, kind of, in terms of, like telling, not telling? So there's such a carefulness in your work to for example, acknowledge racial violence without dwelling on racial violence, right? And there's
without reproducing it.
Yeah, without reproducing it in a way that's so there is, I feel that the passing down of how to tell slavery, of it being sometimes a secret, might be something. Is that, do you think about that?
Yes, I think about that. I think about that a lot. And I did want to sort of try and imagine what it was like for some of those women, particularly women of color and Black women living on that plantation. But at the same time, I did not want to trespass into areas where it meant that I was reproducing vicariously the violence, of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up, it was also true. I had to discover, as it were, through archives and through historical research, how incredibly poor my father's family was in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm.
And to think about what starvation wages that the colonial government, and the companies like Tate and Lyle were paying, what that actually meant for bodies, what it meant for bones, what it meant for organs, what it meant for health, and to think about, a moment in time where, the foundations of what would become a national health system were being put in place in Britain.
Yeah.
But because of the conditions in Jamaica where that was not the case, how starvation wages translated into an already weakened body, so that tuberculosis, for example, had consequences in Jamaica and rather different consequences in the UK, that meant that it was surrounded by shame and couldn't be talked about. I mean, I remember when there was a total moment of revelation, when my father, who started to talk to me about things because of my writing the book. There were a lot of things he wouldn't talk about when I was growing up, but because of working on the book, he became a sort of co-conspirator. But he told me the story of during the 30s, when people were starving, he was sent to the back door of the prison that was actually located on the street where he grew up. And the prisoners, and they would hand out bread that was made in the prison. And people, the prison had the most extraordinary reputation for brutality. Right. Unbelievable. But people were protesting to be let in. Right. Because at least they would be fed. Now, right. What sort of desperation, what sort of conditions does that speak to? Yeah. So I wanted to dwell on those moments and to dwell on those consequences and those possibilities, which I hope is not, making that hungry body just vicarious for consumption of a reader, but actually putting it as a historically constituted subject. And that these were deliberate practices, because Jamaica was under direct colonial control from the middle of the 19th century onwards. So this was the responsibility of Westminster.
Right. And there's this threading together, or of the two islands, and the connections you make between differential modes of economic duress, or different the different ways that poverty is lived in those two spaces. Because I'm thinking, but your family is the kind of this anchor, right, of this, of the ways that this is expressed so differently yet collapse into themselves at the same time. And so
I wanted to use the question of family and ancestors to anchor the book, but it's really a much wider story. That's that's the issue. And so in the UK, I also wanted to show that there were these marginalized places and marginalized people, marginalized from the metropole, who also lived under, incredible poverty. I don't do any easy equations. colonialism, and what is happening in the UK. But I do sort of point out that colonialism has internal consequences. Imperialism has internal consequences in the metropole, as well as external consequences.
And one of the things I was thinking about while reading Imperial Intimacies was how environmental disaster underpins it all. You know, so there is this breadth of, like you said, like tuberculosis, like, you know what I mean? Like there's these ways that these are differently lived in completely different places that are yoked together through empire. And so there, you know, and then that takes us to ecology again, and it takes us to the plantation, and it allows us to think about how the Middle Passage, you know, is one way to begin to think about environmental disaster in our contemporary moment.
Oh, I think it's absolutely key.
Yeah.
And obviously I was absolutely thinking of, you know, contemporary questions of the toxicity of the environment.
Yes.
And its effect on, you know, on the poor and people of color. And, you know, I may at one point be talking about Bath, you know, in the 18th century, but when I'm thinking about water and pollution, and how, you know, the poor are in these areas of water pollution, I'm also obviously thinking about Flint. I mean, I want to give people, readers, ways of opening up those sorts of questions, so that you can think about this particular example that may be in the past, but I haven't closed it in the past. I hope that I've narrated it in a way that people will think, oh, I need to think about ecology, I need to think about environment.
Yeah.
And it's in, you know, its connection and its consequences for people who are poor or living in certain areas, or, you know, so yes, exactly. Yeah. It's absolutely central, I think, to the way in which we have to be writing and researching into the future. These are not separate areas. You're not somehow, oh, a specialist over there in thinking about ecology and the environment. We should all be making it absolutely central to everything we do.
And I found that it really stood out for me in this book, like the way that you detail the you know, what's in the air. That's the only way I can explain it. Like what you inhale is, you know, it makes those connections for you. You cannot think about that without our contemporary moment at least crossing your mind.
Well, because colonialism did not just subjugate bodies. It subjugated environments. Yeah. And it transformed bodies and environments. And we need to think about how the question of the subjugation of people and the oppression of people work hand in hand and have for centuries with the exploitation of the environment and with the destruction of the ecology. These are not separate issues.
Yeah. We have 1 to 2 minutes left in our hour. Can I ask you my last question?
Sure.
Which is, what are you reading right now?
So yeah, I was actually thinking about what was on my desk. Have you read Elizabeth? Oh, it's backwards. Have you read Elizabeth Jane Burnett's The Grassling? It's very interesting in terms of what we were just talking about, ecology and the environment. She's a Black environmental poet. And The Grassling is set in a very particular, you know, part of Devon, and she has a very innovative way of thinking about place and the relation of the Black female body to place in very intimate ways. I mean, under hedgerows and soil, and anyway, that's sort of like really interesting. And then I'm halfway through Just Us by Claudia Rankine. Okay. Which is something, but I've also been spending a lot of time on Isabel Wilkerson's Caste book, because I'm actually writing a sort of long analysis, a sort of
lovely
engagement with it. The deadline's actually just passed, but I think I'm almost there. But you know, I'm really trying to think about why caste is actually not an appropriate substitution for thinking about racial injustice and inequality. So
lovely.
Those are the things that are on my mind at the moment.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Hazel.
Catherine, it's been lovely to see you and to talk to you.
I'm overjoyed. I'm over the moon. Thank you.
Thank you.